Hello, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Grace. It is lovely to have you here. Today I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in May, which seems to be something I'm doing now. In the past, I never really read enough books in a month to do a monthly wrap up, but last month, for the first time ever, I read 6 books, and that was the most I had ever read in one month. And this month, I read 7. So we will see if this is something I can consistently keep up throughout the year, because these are unknown reading heights for me. I do not normally read this much at all. For now though, I'm going to enjoy it and make the most of it. So let's talk about the 7 books that I read this month. The first book that I read this month was Old Enough by Jakobson. This is a contemporary coming-of-age novel about a girl who's torn between the new queer community that she's forming at her college and her old best friend from high school, who doesn't really understand the new world that she wants to be a part of, and also has some links to some traumatic parts of her past. I really enjoyed this one. It's quite heavy at times. This explores moving on after sexual assault, and that is quite a large part of the narrative, so I'd definitely be aware of that and make sure you're in the right place to read this before going in. I personally really enjoyed how this was written. I've seen some mixed reviews about the main character's voice and it coming off a bit too young, which I think could go either way. It's probably quite of its time and has a very Gen Z feeling to it, so I don't know how that will age. But for right now, I quite enjoyed the voice of the main character and the modern queer culture that was represented in this book. I really enjoyed the found family that the main character was finding at her new college in this new life. The main character is bisexual and is still kind of figuring that out. It's reasonably new to her, and there are some really wholesome, sweet moments where we explore that and their relationship with other characters. And this ended up being quite a wholesome book, even though it has some darker themes. It felt quite healing by the end and soft and warm. I listened to the audiobook for this one, and I wonder if that maybe helped me to understand the character's voice a little bit more. I don't know if it would have worked quite as well in a physical book, but I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has read this physically. I really haven't heard many people talking about this book though, so I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has read it at all, what your thoughts were. So yeah, not groundbreaking, but very enjoyable, and it did explore some very interesting themes, and I think had quite an accurate depiction of modern queer culture, and I guess what it's like to be a baby queer. So that was Old Enough by Jakobson. Next, I read a highly anticipated new release, which I actually made a little video about, and I was so excited to get to this one. This is Funny Story by Emily Henry. This was my 3rd Emily Henry book that I've read. I've mentioned on this channel before that I read Happy Place last year and absolutely adored it. That is one of my favourite books ever. It emotionally devastated me. And I've also read Beach Read, and I really enjoyed that one too, though not quite to the same level of emotional impact. So I had very high hopes for this one, and I did enjoy it, but it didn't quite hit as hard for me, unfortunately. This is the story of Daphne, who has just been left by her fiance for his childhood best friend, who was also the girlfriend of Peter, the man that she has now been forced to move in with because she has nowhere else to go after this breakup. This is very much a forced proximity kind of book. They bond over their heartbreak and then decide to maybe cause some shenanigans by posting together on social media and giving the impression to both of their exes that maybe they're getting together. I enjoyed this one. I had fun. It made me laugh several times, and I really enjoyed the side characters in here. Daphne's new friend that she makes at the library that she works at, I absolutely loved. She was great. And Peter's sister was also a really interesting character. I often really like the way that Emily Henry writes her side characters and makes them quite rounded characters in themselves, rather than just pieces to move around in order for the main plot between the main character and the romantic interest to happen. But this didn't quite have the emotional impact for me that I wanted it to. I don't know if it just wasn't right for me. I think Happy Place had themes in it that just hit home personally for me, whereas this maybe I couldn't relate to as much. I definitely would recommend giving it a go. If you've enjoyed other Emily Henrys, you'll probably enjoy this one. I think maybe the relationship felt a little bit underdeveloped to me. It didn't feel like this spanned that greater period of time, and both of these characters were recovering from quite a long relationship that they'd just gotten out of, and that heartbreak that caused, so it felt a little bit like a rebound. And that is of course discussed in here. Both of them are aware of the questionable situation that they might be in, but I think for me it just didn't quite work. I'm always in favor of having a bit more of a break after a relationship, spending time with yourself. So I wasn't fully on board with them getting together. I didn't know if it was going to be the best choice for their characters. I still did like them. I enjoyed both of their characters and I really liked the banter between them. Emily Henry is just so good at writing witty banter. This just wasn't perfectly to my taste, I don't think. But I am excited to read definitely Book Lovers next and see what I think of that one. But this is Funny Story by Emily Henry. The next book that I got to, I was craving some fantasy. I've noticed I really haven't read that much just solid fantasy this year, which is wild because that is my go-to genre. I've read a lot of kind of historical fantasy or romantasy, but not that much primarily focused fantasy. And I heard Carrie from Carrie Can Read recommend this one. This is Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee. I've not read anything by Fonda Lee before. I've heard really good things about the Jade City series, but I'm not that big of an urban fantasy girl. This sounded a lot more appealing to me. This was actually a novella. I listened to the audiobook and it was 4 hours long, but this is set in a world in which rocks, giant birds of prey, are trained and paired up with rookas to hunt and kill manticores. When she was young, the main character Esther's family were hit by a brutal manticore attack, and so she decides to become a rooka and train with a rock to hunt down these monsters so that the rest of the people in this country can be safe. I really enjoyed the relationship between the rookas and the rocks. It was really interestingly explored, the codependency between the two of them, but really at the end of the day, the fact that the rooka needs the rock more and the rock could kill them if they wanted to. The obsession that the main character has with her rock was really interestingly described, and I really enjoyed that not too much was crammed in here plot-wise. Things do happen, but it's not the most giant fantasy plot you've ever read, which I think would have been too much in this short space of time. I think Fonda Lee wrote just the right amount of plot in here that there was still room to breathe and have beautiful writing and interesting characters and explore that relationship between Rock and Ruka really well. I think I maybe didn't have quite enough time to fully invest my emotions in the characters, but I don't know if that's just because I'm so used to having a big chunky fantasy book, but I did really enjoy this one, especially the way that it ended. This, I think, has been one of the most satisfying endings I've read in quite a while. To me, it just felt like the story wrapped up perfectly. So if you're a fan of magical creatures and human relationships with them in fantasy, if you enjoyed books like Eragon or the How to Train Your Dragon films and want something maybe a little bit more grown up than that, I would definitely recommend Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee. The next book I read was the first poetry book I have read in quite some time. I used to be much more of a poetry reader and I'd really like to get back into it a little bit. So this is The Orange and Other Poems by Wendy Cope. I have been unable to escape the poem The Orange on the internet for quite some time now, which is fair enough because it is a very lovely poem. But I wanted to give a proper collection of Wendy Cope's writing a try because it feels quite different to the poetry I would normally go for. And this was definitely a different experience for me. Her writing is a lot more blunt and less flowery than the poetry I usually read. And I did really enjoy that change in style and the funny moments in here as well. There are quite a few poems in here that are meant to make you laugh. I would say this isn't necessarily my favorite kind of poetry personally. I like having to analyze something a little bit, and most of these you could kind of read them once and understand what they were getting at. I'm sure you would get more out of them from a second read, but it was quite refreshing to read a different style of poetry and something that was probably a little bit less pretentious than a lot of the poetry I've read. I think my favourite poems in here were After the Lunch and some more light verse, which happen to be on the same page. And of course, the orange itself. I think this is probably a great way to start if you've not read any poetry before. There are some really lovely, wholesome moments in here and some really well captured feelings, I think. But nothing that's going to make you panic and think, I have no idea what's going on here. So that is The Orange and Other Poems by Wendy Cope. Now, speaking of flowery writing, the next book that I read is The Gloaming by Kirsty Logan. How do I describe this book? This is set on an island in a world similar to ours, but not quite the same. It's kind of unclear if it's meant to be our world because there are some magical properties that it has. For example, on this island, people don't die. They go up to the top of one particular cliff and turn into stone, looking out at the sea. This is the story of a family who moved to this island to try to renovate this old giant house and turn it into, I guess, a bed and breakfast. And this explores every character within this family. The parents, the mother used to be a ballet dancer and the father used to be a boxer, and then they fell in love and had 3 children, 2 girls, Mara and Isla, and a young boy called B. And reasonably early on in the book, tragedy strikes this family, and the rest of the story describes how they deal with this loss. This is a very lyrically written book and it's beautiful, but I think for me at moments it didn't quite get its meaning across. I could tell that there was some allegory going on, some metaphor, but I didn't always feel like the message was quite sticking the landing. I was appreciating how gorgeous the writing was, but I wasn't necessarily emotionally as invested as I wanted to be. I enjoyed the elements of magic in this and the power of the sea. There are also moments where characters were so brutally honest. They really didn't shy away from how they felt, even if it was something they shouldn't really feel. There was also a sapphic relationship that developed in here, which I really enjoyed. It was very complex and definitely explored one of the characters' need for their life to be sort of a fairy tale and how that feels when you're faced with reality instead. This was a strange one. I still don't really know how to feel about it. I did enjoy it, but I felt a little bit detached. There is, I hesitate to say, a little bit of a twist in here, which I did think was really interesting, but it didn't quite hit me emotionally in the way that I felt like it should do. I think if you enjoy really lyrical writing and magical realism and stories that are heavy on the vibes, especially if that is ocean related vibes that you enjoy, then I would give this one a go. But I don't think it quite did for me what it intended to, but still very beautifully written. So that is The Gloaming by Kirsty Logan. The next book I got to was another poetry book and I love this one. This is A Recipe for Sorcery by Vanessa Kisuule. I picked this one up at the library mostly because it had the word sorcery in the title and I was looking for poetry books and that sounded like my kind of thing, and I'm so glad that I stumbled upon it because I thought this was so beautifully written. Both food and sorcery are big themes in here, though I'd say food more strongly. There are several poems in here that are just about food and several that are formatted as if they are recipes. So there'll be a recipe for release or retaliation and it will have ingredients and then a method, both of which are quite abstract, and I really enjoyed that format. But in general, I think that this poet's writing is just really sharp, often quite wry. There's some humour in here, but also a lot of magic. This definitely is the kind of poetry that I will need to reread several times, and I think I want to get my own copy of this now so that I can annotate it and properly break it down and read it several times over. This has a lot of female rage in it, which I personally really enjoyed. And there are also several poems about the experience of living in the UK as a person of colour, which were really interesting. It's kind of split into sections, each of which begins with one of those recipe poems, and whatever it's a recipe for is then a theme for that section. And my favourite section in here was definitely A Recipe for Retaliation. I really enjoyed that poem itself, as well as The Skies Are Grey with Remorse, and then a poem called Whore, which is told from the perspective of one of Martin Luther King's mistresses. They definitely don't pull any punches, and I really appreciated that. So if you are a poetry person and you enjoy really sharp, incisive, progressive feminist poetry, poetry that deals with racism, then I would definitely recommend A Recipe for Sorcery by Vanessa Kisuule. Now, the last book that I read this month was a lovely little romance that I've been wanting to get to for quite some time, especially since I realised that the author actually comes from very near to my hometown and sets their books there. I don't know why, but I'd assumed they were American. I think often with popular romance writers, I just assume that they're from America. But it was really fun to read this book that was set in a place that I knew. So this is Take a Hint, Dani Brown by Talia Hibbert. I think this is technically the second book in the Brown sisters series. There is a book written about each of the sisters in this family, but they stand on their own. The only thing it really spoils is the fact that the older sister gets together with their romantic interest, which we all know is going to happen. But this is the story of Danica Brown, who is a literature professor at a university, and she is very focused on her work and her academia and doesn't want a relationship at all. She has had bad experiences in the past with relationships and doesn't think that she can do them. So all she wants is something casual. And when the security guard that she's befriended in her uni building, fireman, carries her out of the building after she's been stuck in a lift, or an elevator if you're American, and this video goes viral, he asks her if they can continue to fake this relationship in order to give him positive publicity for the charity that he runs, and she takes this as a sign that he is meant to be her friend with benefits casual relationship that she was looking for. The only problem is that Zafir, this security guard, is a hopeless romantic, and Dani is worried that he will want more from her than she can give. This was such a sweet read. It was definitely pretty spicy and does not shy away from any particular terms. There are no euphemisms in here. It will tell you how it is, which honestly I kind of love to see, but it made me laugh sometimes. But even though it has that side to it, it's still incredibly sweet. I really enjoyed how the male lead in this book was allowed to be soft, and he had anxiety, and the charity that he'd created focused on helping younger boys to talk about their mental health and how they were feeling and tackle their emotions head on. And I really enjoyed seeing that rather than one of those alpha male love interest leads. I also really appreciated Dani's confidence in herself. Even though she had insecurities and issues, she was also allowed to be confident. She was quite complicated, and those complicated emotions were given the space that they deserved, I think. This is definitely one of my favourite romances I've read, I think just because the two main characters didn't feel like they were just fitting into those classic archetypal romantic leads. They felt complicated and like they broke those stereotypes and were allowed to be feminine and confident and then masculine and sensitive. I really appreciated that. This also made me laugh several times. There's a lot of sass and banter going back and forth between these characters, and I thought that was really well written. So that is Take a Hint, Dani Brown by Talia Hibbert. So those are all of the books that I read this month. It was a bit of a mixed reading month. There were several books that I really enjoyed, and there were some that didn't quite work for me. But I think, again, I still haven't found any books that I have absolutely adored yet this year. I'm definitely hunting for that elusive 5-star read, but fingers crossed we'll get there in June. I would love to hear about your reading month this May. What was your favourite book that you read this month, or did you not have a great reading month? Either way, I hope you find some books that you love in June, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye bye.